Maybe if you spent less time making excuses about your war stories and more time actually working, you'd meet your quotas like everyone else. The cruel words echoed across the open office floor of Pinnacle Insurance Solutions, causing keyboards to stop clicking and conversations to halt mid-sentence. It was 3:15 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, and the bustling sales floor had just witnessed something that would be seared into every employee's memory. The voice belonged to Derek Matheson, a 32-year-old regional sales manager whose designer suit and perfectly styled hair reflected his inflated sense of importance. He stood with his arms crossed, looking down at one of his sales representatives with undisguised contempt. Derek had been promoted 6 months ago and had quickly developed a reputation for his harsh management style and complete lack of empathy. Sitting at desk number 47 was James Crawford, a 45-year-old man whose quiet demeanor and methodical work habits had made him popular among his colleagues. He wore simple khakis and a button-down shirt, with sleeves that couldn't quite hide the burn scars that extended from his wrists to his elbows. His left leg bore the evidence of old injuries, a slight limp that he never complained about, though observant co-workers had noticed he sometimes shifted uncomfortably during long meetings. The office around them buzzed with the typical energy of a busy insurance firm. Phones rang constantly, computer screens glowed with spreadsheets and client information, and the coffee machine in the break room worked overtime. Fluorescent lights cast their harsh glow over rows of cubicles where dozens of employees tried to focus on their work while stealing glances at the confrontation unfolding near the corner office. James had simply asked for a brief extension on a client presentation, mentioning that his old injuries were causing him more pain than usual in the changing weather. It was a reasonable request from someone who consistently ranked in the company's top performers. James Callahan hadn't always been a high school track coach in this small town. 8 years ago, he'd been Master Sergeant James Callahan, U.S. Army Ranger, leading special reconnaissance missions in terrain most Americans couldn't find on a map. His weathered face carried the subtle marks of Samion. He who had seen things most people only experience in movies. Lines around his eyes from squinting under desert suns, a thin scar along his jawline, and a perpetual alertness that never quite faded. Looking at him now in his modest running gear, faded marathon shirt, standard issue shorts, and a simple black prosthetic where his left leg should have been, most people would never guess he'd once been among America's most elite soldiers. The small Ranger tab tattoo on his right forearm was often the only visible hint of his service, though those who knew what to look for might notice the military precision in his posture or the quiet authority in his voice. After losing his leg in an IED explosion, James had rebuilt his life one painful step at a time. Physical therapy had been brutal, but he'd approached rehabilitation with the same determination that had earned him 3 commendation medals. Running became his therapy, his meditation, and eventually, his new mission. When the high school needed a track coach 4 years ago, James had stepped up, transforming a mediocre team into regional champions. The race official, whose name tag read Morton Phillips, event coordinator, was about 30 years younger than James. His polo shirt was crisp, his khakis perfectly pressed, and his clipboard seemed to function as both shield and weapon. Morton had been running this event for only 2 years, but he carried himself with the inflated importance of someone who believed rules were sacred texts rather than guidelines for fair play. "I've reviewed your application 3 times now," Morton said, flipping papers on his clipboard with theatrical precision. "And I'm sorry, but I simply can't make an exception. This is a sanctioned event with clear equipment regulations." He lowered his voice, as though offering a kindness. "Perhaps there are special events more suited to your situation." Around them, other runners continued their warm-ups, though many were now casting uncomfortable glances toward the confrontation. Several recognized James. He was something of a local legend, both for his coaching and for completing the Boston Marathon the previous year. A few parents from the high school stood nearby, their expressions darkening as they overheard the conversation. James's students, 5 teenagers in matching track uniforms, huddled together nearby, whispering among themselves. One girl, the team captain, looked ready to march over and intervene, but James caught her eye and subtly shook his head. Comment, respect. If you believe our veterans deserve better than this treatment after sacrificing everything for our freedom. James took a deep breath, counting silently to 5, a habit from his combat days when keeping cool could mean the difference between life and death. Mr. Phillips, I've competed in sanctioned events across the country. My prosthetic doesn't provide any mechanical advantage. In fact, it requires 30% more energy expenditure than a biological limb. He reached into his bag again, producing a folder with documentation. Here are my certification papers from the National Adaptive Athletics Association. Phillips glanced at the papers with obvious disinterest. Those certifications might work elsewhere, but our local committee has stricter standards. We've had problems before. He didn't elaborate on what those problems might have been. I'm simply enforcing the rules as written. Nothing personal. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, watching the exchange. The starting line was beginning to fill with other runners, their bibs neatly pinned to their chests, water bottles and energy gels in hand. The atmosphere had shifted from pre-race excitement to uncomfortable tension. Morton, a woman in a race volunteer shirt, approached cautiously. Maybe we could get a second opinion from the committee? James has been part of this community for years. Phillips shot her a look that stopped her mid-sentence. Lisa, I am the committee's representative on site. The decision has been made. He turned back to James. Sir, I need to ask you to clear the starting area. One of James's students stepped forward, Ryan, a lanky 17-year-old who had transformed from a troubled kid to team captain under James's guidance. This isn't right, coach. You're the reason half of us are even runners. It's okay, Ryan, James said quietly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Not every battle needs fighting. Phillips checked his watch ostentatiously. 15 minutes to start time. I have other matters to attend to. He smirked slightly. Perhaps next year you could volunteer instead. We always need people at the water stations. Something flashed in James's eyes, not anger, but a momentary glimpse of the steel that had carried him through firefights and the long months of rehabilitation. For a split second, Phillips seemed to realize he might have crossed a line, but the moment passed, and his officious demeanor returned. I completed the Boston Marathon last year, James said, his voice level. Finished in the top third overall. Congratulations, Phillips replied with a thin smile. But Boston and this event have different standards. And frankly, I'm concerned about liability. If he paused, glancing at the prosthetic. Equipment were to malfunction, we could be held responsible. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the growing crowd. An older man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap shook his head in disgust. Shameful, he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Phillips raised his voice slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the shifting sentiment. I'm going to have to insist you move to the spectator area now. You're disrupting the pre-race procedures. James stood perfectly still, a skill honed through countless hours of surveillance operations. His expression revealed nothing, but the slight whitening of his knuckles as he gripped his folder betrayed his frustration. I have every right to participate, James said finally, producing another document. This is a letter from Dr. Richard Hammond at the VA confirming my prosthetic meets all standard athletic competition requirements. Phillips took the letter, glanced at it for barely 3 seconds, then tore it in half. Outdated information. Our guidelines were updated last month. He dropped the torn paper into a nearby trash can. Now, are you going to leave voluntarily, or do I need to call security? Several phones in the crowd were now pointed their way, recording the confrontation. James noticed, but remained focused on Phillips, whose face had flushed with the power of authority. You have no idea what I've done or what I've overcome to be here today, James said, his voice so quiet that Phillips had to lean in slightly to hear him. Phillips opened his mouth to respond when the distant sound of engines cut through the morning air. Not the casual arrival of late participants, but something else entirely, the synchronized growl of multiple powerful vehicles moving with purpose. Heads turned toward the park entrance as 3 black SUVs with government plates pulled up in perfect formation, their tires crunching on the gravel. The race announcer's voice faltered mid-sentence as the vehicles came to a stop. A sudden hush fell over the crowd as the doors opened simultaneously. From the lead vehicle emerged a tall man in a crisp military uniform adorned with the insignia of a U.S. Army Special Operations Commander. Colonel Michael Ramirez moved with the calm authority of someone accustomed to entering high-stakes situations. Behind him, 6 soldiers in formal dress uniforms formed a precise line. Phillips's face drained of color. "What is this?" he whispered, the clipboard now clutched to his chest like armor. Colonel Ramirez scanned the crowd with practiced efficiency until his eyes locked on James. For a brief moment, the commander's professional demeanor softened. Then he strode directly toward them, his footsteps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a pathway through the starting area. "Master Sergeant Callahan," Colonel Ramirez said, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering. He stopped precisely 3 feet from James and rendered a perfect salute. James straightened automatically, muscle memory from years of service taking over. He returned the salute with precision. "Sir," James acknowledged, the simple word carrying the weight of their shared history. Colonel Ramirez turned slightly to address the gathering crowd, but his words were clearly directed at Phillips. "I apologize for interrupting your event. I'm Colonel Michael Ramirez, commander of the 3rd Special Operations Group. I understand there's some confusion regarding Master Sergeant Callahan's participation today." Phillips swallowed hard. "There's no confusion, sir. Our rules clearly state, Master Sergeant James Callahan," Colonel Ramirez continued as if Phillips hadn't spoken, "served under my command during Operation Mountain Shadow. Perhaps you're familiar with it." He didn't wait for an answer. It was classified until last year. On April 17, 2017, our unit was ambushed in a mountain pass. Enemy combatants had superior positioning and firepower. The colonel's voice remained steady, but those closest could see the emotion in his eyes. Sergeant Callahan identified an enemy sniper nest that had pinned down half our squad. Despite heavy fire, he advanced alone to provide covering fire so his team could reach safety. One of the uniformed soldiers produced a tablet and handed it to a race official, not Phillips, but an older woman who appeared to be in charge of the event committee. She studied the screen, her expression transitioning from confusion to shock. During extraction, Sergeant Callahan's position took a direct hit from an RPG. Despite catastrophic injuries to his left leg and shrapnel wounds across his body, he continued returning fire, allowing the medevac helicopter to land safely and extract 3 critically wounded teammates. The colonel paused, allowing his words to settle over the crowd. Several people had placed hands over their hearts. The Vietnam veteran removed his cap respectfully. Sergeant Callahan was the last man on that helicopter. He lost his leg that day, but he never lost his courage or his commitment to excellence. Colonel Ramirez turned fully toward Phillips now. "The prosthetic you're so concerned about? It replaced a limb sacrificed in service to this country." 2 more military vehicles pulled up, a medical transport with U.S. Army markings and a black sedan. From the sedan emerged a woman in a business suit carrying a leather portfolio. "This is Major Dr. Sarah Andrews, head of the Military Adaptive Athletics Program," Colonel Ramirez said as the woman approached. "And she's brought something that might interest you." Phillips's clipboard now hung limply at his side. "I was just following protocol," he said weakly. Major Andrews fixed Phillips with a look that made him step backward involuntarily. "Mr. Phillips, I've reviewed your event regulations. There is nothing, I repeat, nothing, in them that would disqualify Sergeant Callahan's prosthetic from competition. In fact," she opened her portfolio, "your organization accepted federal grant money last year that specifically requires compliance with adaptive athlete inclusion standards." Colonel Ramirez nodded to one of his aides, who stepped forward with a communication device. "I have the Secretary of the Army on standby. He was quite interested to hear about this situation, particularly since this event is named the Veterans Memorial Marathon and takes place on federal land under special permit." The crowd had grown silent. Every face turned toward the confrontation. The older woman from the event committee approached, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Colonel Ramirez, I'm Patricia Langdon, event director. I had no idea this was happening." She glared at Phillips. Morton was instructed to make reasonable accommodations for all participants, especially veterans. Phillips attempted to recover some authority. "Ms. Langdon, I was simply following Section 7 of the Section 7, Major Andrews interrupted, specifically exempts prosthetics that comply with international adaptive sports regulations. Sergeant Callahan's model is approved by 5 different athletic governing bodies." She produced a document with multiple official seals, "including yours." Colonel Ramirez nodded to another aide, who activated a portable speaker system. The colonel's voice now carried across the entire starting area. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but I believe some context is necessary here. Master Sergeant James Callahan isn't just a veteran who lost his leg in combat. He is the recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry in action." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Several people removed caps or placed hands over hearts. The citation reads, the colonel continued, producing an official document. With complete disregard for his own safety, Sergeant Callahan repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to provide covering fire for his wounded comrades. Despite sustaining catastrophic injuries, he maintained his position until all personnel were safely extracted. What the citation doesn't mention is that Sergeant Callahan personally saved my life that day. The colonel's professional demeanor cracked slightly. He carried me 200 meters under fire after I took a bullet to the chest. He applied a tourniquet to my arm while simultaneously returning fire. And when the medevac arrived, he insisted I go first, despite his own leg being. He paused, composing himself. Well, let's just say what was left of it. Phillips had begun to shrink visibly, his earlier confidence evaporating. Patricia Langdon stepped forward. "Morton, give me that clipboard. You're relieved of your duties, effective immediately." One of James's students, the team captain, had been recording everything on her phone. She leaned toward her teammates and whispered something that made them nod vigorously. Colonel Ramirez wasn't finished. After 15 surgeries and months of rehabilitation, Sergeant Callahan didn't just learn to walk again. He learned to run. And not just run, excel. Last year, he completed the Marine Corps Marathon in 3 hours and 42 minutes, finishing ahead of 75% of able-bodied participants. He then used his platform to raise over $50,000 for wounded warrior programs. The colonel turned to address the crowd directly. Many of you may not know that after his medical discharge, Sergeant Callahan could have taken a comfortable position with military contractors. Instead, he chose to serve this community as a teacher and coach, transforming your high school track program and mentoring dozens of young athletes. One by one, James's students stepped forward, forming a line behind their coach. Ryan, the team captain, spoke up. "Coach Callahan taught us that the only real limitations are the ones we accept. We're not running today unless he runs too." Other runners began removing their bibs in solidarity. "If he's out, I'm out," said a middle-aged woman in professional running gear. "My brother served 2 tours in Afghanistan. This is disgraceful." Patricia Langdon had been conferring with other officials, who now looked thoroughly chastened. She approached James and Colonel Ramirez. "Sergeant Callahan, on behalf of the entire Marathon Committee, I offer our deepest apologies. Not only are you welcome to participate, but we would be honored if you would agree to be recognized as our guest of honor before the race begins." Phillips, now completely sidelined, attempted to slip away into the crowd. 2 of Colonel Ramirez's aides smoothly intercepted him. "Mr. Phillips," one said quietly, "the colonel would appreciate it if you remained available for the completion of this matter." Major Andrews stepped closer to James. "Sergeant, if I may?" She gestured to his prosthetic. "That's the Defender Pro model, correct? I was on the development team at Walter Reed. May I?" With James's nod of permission, she knelt to examine the prosthetic briefly. Standing again, she announced, "This is literally the same model used by 3 Paralympic gold medalists last year. If anything, it's less advanced than what many competitive adaptive athletes use." 10 minutes later, the marathon had been transformed. Colonel Ramirez stood at the starting line with a microphone while James prepared with the other runners. Phillips had been escorted to a small operations tent where 2 military officers were conducting a thorough review of the event's grant compliance. "Before we begin today's race," Colonel Ramirez announced, "I'd like to thank the Marathon Committee for their quick correction of this unfortunate situation. The true measure of an organization isn't whether mistakes are made. It's how they respond when those mistakes come to light." Patricia Langdon stepped forward and presented James with a special bib labeled Honored Veteran. The crowd erupted in applause as James nodded his thanks, his usual stoicism briefly giving way to a hint of emotion. The colonel raised his hand for silence. "Today, we're not just running a race. We're demonstrating what this country stands for. Master Sergeant Callahan didn't just serve America. Overseas, he continues to serve through his work with young people, through his example of perseverance, and through his refusal to accept artificial limitations. The starting pistol was handed to Colonel Ramirez. James took his position among the other runners, many of whom reached out to pat his shoulder or shake his hand. His students stood on the sidelines, their faces beaming with pride. "Marathon participants, take your marks," came the announcement. Colonel Ramirez raised the starter pistol. "Ready, set." A crisp shot rang out, and the runners surged forward, James moving with the fluid, determined stride he'd developed through thousands of hours of practice and sheer force of will. As the runners disappeared around the first bend, Colonel Ramirez and his team remained in place. A representative from the mayor's office approached, looking concerned. "Will you be shutting us down, Colonel?" Colonel Ramirez shook his head. "No need. But I believe Mr. Phillips might benefit from some additional education on ADA compliance and veteran affairs." He gestured toward the operations tent. "My staff will ensure he receives it." 3 hours and 47 minutes later, James crossed the finish line, not first, but solidly in the top quarter of all participants. Colonel Ramirez was waiting, along with James's students and a crowd that had swelled to 3 times its usual size as word of the morning's events spread through social media. As James received his finisher's medal, the colonel spoke quietly to him. "Still saving people, I see. Those kids look at you like you hung the moon." James smiled, finally allowing himself to fully relax. "Just trying to live up to what we fought for, sir." The lesson was not lost on anyone present. Judge not by appearances, but by character, not by limitations, but by determination, and always remember that the veterans among us may not wear their medals or their scars visibly, but they carry with them a spirit that defines the very best of America. Share this video to honor all veterans who continue to overcome obstacles, even after their service has ended.